So we are going to begin our panel. I'm just going to do a quick introduction for all of our attendees. My name is Liam Barrett. I'm currently a second-year law student at Georgetown Law, and I'm the Voting Rights Issue Director for the Georgetown Law ACLU. The Georgetown Law ACLU's main purpose is to promote discussions of civil liberties on campus, to involve students in the Georgetown community in the protection of those liberties, and to support local ACLU affiliates however possible. We're also hosting today's panel with Georgetown Law Students for Democratic Reform, who work alongside us in many events in many capacities to promote better, freer, fair democracy and to involve Georgetown Law students and the Georgetown Law communities in that process. Today's panel, The Future of Voting Rights, is focused on threats to and opportunities to expand the right to vote in the wake of the 2020 election, ongoing voter suppression efforts, and efforts on a national, state, and local level to expand and protect the right to vote. We're joined today by a fantastic panel of leaders who specialize in voting rights and constitutional advocacy. Our moderator for today's panel is Professor Mary McCord. Mary McCord is a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center and serves as the legal director at Georgetown Law's Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. The Institute, based at Georgetown University Law Center, draws on expert litigators, savvy litigation strategy, and the constitutional scholarship of Georgetown to vindicate individuals' rights and protect America's constitutional way of life. Our panelists for today are Dr. Shirley Weber and Desmond Meade. Dr. Shirley Weber currently serves as California's Secretary of State. Although her family moved to California when Dr. Weber was 3 years old, it was her family's experiences in the Jim Crow South that has driven her activism and legislative work. She's fought to expand civil rights for all Californians in her time in the California State Assembly, including restoring voting rights for individuals who have completed their prison term. Dr. Weber attended the University of California, Los Angeles, where she received her bachelor's, master's, and PhD by the age of 26. After retiring as a college professor, Dr. Weber served 4 terms as an assembly member representing California's 79th district, which includes parts of the city of San Diego, my hometown, as well as several cities and communities in the San Diego region. She was nominated to serve as the California Secretary of State by Governor Gavin Newsom on December 22nd, and was sworn into her office on January 29th. She is California's first Black Secretary of State and only the first African-American to serve in a state constitutional office in California's 170-year-old history. Desmond Meade is a voting rights activist and executive director of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. He was born in St. Croix and moved to Miami with his parents when he was 5. After a brief term of imprisonment, Meade graduated from Miami-Dade College in 2010 and finished law school at Florida International University in 2013. Florida law, however, prevents him or anyone with a past felony conviction from voting or being admitted to the Florida bar, or did. As chair of Floridians for Fair Democracy, Meade led the successful effort to pass Florida's Amendment 4, a 2018 state initiative that restored voting rights to over 1.4 million Floridians with previous felony convictions, which was later attacked by the Florida State Assembly. In 2019, Time magazine named him as one of the 100 most influential people. He is also the author of Let My People Vote, My Battle to Restore the Civil Rights of Returning Citizens. And unfortunately, we could not be joined tonight by our final panelist, Professor Addison Francois, who directs Georgetown Law's Civil Rights Clinic, as he is currently stuck in a deposition. With that, I'm going to hand over our program to Professor McCord.
Thanks so much, Liam. And I'm just so honored to be here with 2 real titans when it comes to voting rights and civil rights and trying to make sure more people can actually exercise the franchise in the United States. And given that both of you have been involved with re-enfranchisement efforts for people who have been convicted of crimes but have served their sentences, I'd like to just start there because I think we have such an incredible wealth of experience. And particularly, Desmond, if I could start with you, I think what you were able to put together in Florida and achieve with passing that amendment was such a historic moment. And then, it was just, I thought, disgraceful to then watch the legislature really try to gut it with their efforts to restrict the franchise to only those who had paid all fines and fees that they might have assessed, regardless of their ability to pay at all. And in fact, my organization was privileged to file a brief in the challenge to that law, arguing that that is wealth-based discrimination in violation of the Constitution. But could you tell us the story, if you would, of that effort, not only to get the amendment passed, but also then to have to deal with this attempt to really undermine everything that you and all of the other activists had accomplished?
Thank you so much, Professor McCord, and thanks to Georgetown Law for inviting me. And you're right, it is, matter of fact, while you were speaking, I was thinking that that story is a tale of two cities, right? Or a tale of two different worlds, because in one world, we seen something that was just amazing and beautiful and that was driven by love. And then on the other side, in the other story, what you seen was what happens when you have partisan politics involved and how real people suffer. In 2014, we launched the ballot initiative because at the time, Florida was the worst state in the country as it relates to felon disenfranchisement, with over 1.5 million people living in the state that could not vote because of a prior felony conviction. While we made some headway a few years before, the administration at the time rolled back those policies and basically made it even more impossible for a person to be able to have their civil rights restored by instituting waiting periods of 5 or 7 years before a person could even apply. And let me tell you, as a side note, it was so bad that I was at a hearing today in Tallahassee, and we had an attorney speak and talk about one of his clients that have applied to have his civil rights restored in 2008, and he's still waiting to have a hearing. And so seeing how, when we talk about voting, I don't think that there's no greater indicator of citizenship than actually being able to vote. And to think that we were in a situation in Florida where 4 politicians decided who could vote and who couldn't vote, we knew that we had to take it out of the hands of the politicians. And so we launched this ballot initiative in 2014, and we built it not as a bipartisan movement, not even as a nonpartisan movement, but rather as an organic grassroots movement that welcomed and enjoyed bipartisan support, because we didn't want to lead with the politics. We chose rather to lead with the people. And when we did that, we were able to bring together people from all walks of life and all political persuasions, all demographics, to vote yes on Amendment 4. And in November of 2018, we successfully passed Amendment 4 with over 64% of the vote. Over 5.1 million people voted yes on Amendment 4. And that was 1 million more people that voted for Amendment 4 than for our current governor, right? And what Amendment 4 did was it created an alternative pathway for an American citizen to be able to vote other than having to grovel at the feet of the governor or any politician. And it clearly stated that if you were not convicted of a felony sexual offense, or if you were not convicted of murder, upon completion of your sentence, that you would automatically have the right to vote. And so I tell folks that, you think about that when you talk about voting, especially voting rights for people with felony convictions, that's a very controversial topic. And so we engage in a controversial topic in a controversial state as Florida, and it's still holding true to that, right? We've seen the recent election, and we were doing it during a controversial time, but yet we had no opposition. And what I love to tell folks was that those 5.1 million votes wasn't based on hate or fear, but rather they were votes that was based on love, forgiveness, and redemption, that we are a country of second chances, and people generally believe that folks should have a second chance. And they generally believe that if you're an American citizen, the right to vote, right, should not be taken away or barred from you because of a prior felony conviction, especially after you've served your time or paid your debt to society. So that was a beautiful moment that lasted but a day or two. And the next thing you know, we had a legislature that was dominated by Republicans that decided that they wanted to enact legislation that would implement Amendment 4. Now, let me tell you, I have to tell you this brief story. What this reminds me of, and this is a story that I'm making up, but about legislators, right, that walked past a homeless family for years, right, and years and years and years, whether it was rain, sleet, or snow, though they seen this family out there with no protection, and they walked past and didn't care about it. But then the people in the community came together and decided to build this family a home. And the minute the people built the home, legislators are showing up trying to dictate how to furnish that home, right? And that's what we experienced, the arrogance of the legislators saying that, of all, we don't like that people take care of us in their own hands, which is that's being against, it's what democracy is all about. But then going a step further and saying that we're going to show you how we want to do it. And they did. And one of the main things that they did was they required the payment of all outstanding legal financial obligations before a person could experience the benefit of Amendment 4. And we know you talked about you filing an amicus brief in the lawsuit that filed law. And we actually won this case in the Northern District Court in Florida. And when the judge, he hit the nail right on the head. And he said that this was a poll tax and that access to the ballot box should not be determined by how much money a person makes. And it was a great, solid ruling, but unfortunately it was short-lived because the state of Florida believes that it is appropriate for a person to be forced to choose between putting food on their table, voting, or choose between paying their rent or their mortgage or voting. And unfortunately, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with them and required that now everyone has to pay. And we're talking, and I will end here, but I think it's so critical because we're talking about the convoluting two different types of legal financial obligations. We know that there's a type that is intimately attached to a crime that a person has been convicted of, all right, that is statutorily imposed. But then you have financial obligations that's basically the cost of doing business in court, and they can be for a wide variety of reasons. And unfortunately, the 11th Circuit, as well as our Florida Supreme Court, said, you know what, we're grouping everything together, and you have to pay everything before you're able to vote. And that impacted, out of the 1.4 million people, over 700,000 American citizens in the state of Florida. And unfortunately, you know, we engage in some great efforts, even in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. But unfortunately, a great deal of those 700,000 folks did not get a chance to participate in this previous election. But we're still fighting to make sure that every one of the 1.4 million individuals do have an opportunity to do so. And later on in this discussion, hopefully I can give you all a very positive update on where we stand. But once again, it is a pleasure being on this panel, especially with Powerhouse that I see to my right. And so I'm going to be quiet and give everyone else a chance to weigh in on some things. Thank you.
That's just such a moving story. I thank you for sharing it. And, you know, I know that there were heroic efforts there, you know, up until the very last minute to pay off as many of these fines by people donating from all over. But one of the challenges I recall is that it was hard to even figure out how much a person owed because of so we'll come back to that. But Dr. Weber, you know, you've been also involved in expanding the franchise and also in re-enfranchising people who had served their times. And I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit more historically about why this is so important and, you know, what other things it, you know, is an effort to address. Obviously, citizens who have paid their time, they have served their sentences, they have given, you know, they have done exactly what our laws require of them. them, are entitled to that opportunity to vote. But it says, I just wonder if you think it says a little bit more, in terms of speaking to some of the racial inequities in our history when we see these types of efforts to squash this and the monumental effort it takes to re-enfranchise these voters.
Well, the thing that thank you so much, and it's good to be here. Good to be here with Mr. Meade and knowing his struggle, remembering Florida and all the challenges down there. And so it's great to know that that struggle continues, that we don't give up, we continue to fight, and that's really, really important. So I want to thank him for all of his efforts. One of the things, California is probably the most liberal state when it comes to the voting rights. And that's been fortunate. And the unfortunate thing is that oftentimes people don't know about it. And people don't tell people about it. And they don't create opportunities for people to do it. And so when I came into the legislature, the history of voting in this country, period, in the South and throughout, and many of the laws that exist, whether it's shooting people in the back or fleeing felon and so forth and so on, are often based upon the anti-slavery kinds of efforts that in this country, California's participation in slavery as well as incarceration. We have a bill now to take away the word slavery out of our Constitution because it allows people to analogize slavery with incarceration. And so this whole legacy is there about who should vote, who should not vote, who should get the right to vote, whether it's women, men, whether it's land, property, all those kinds of things. People recognize the power of voting and wanted to decide that there were some citizens who were more equal to vote than others. And I often say this is, supposedly what this country was fought on, but no taxation without representation. That if you're taxing me and yet I can't decide who represents me, a very fundamental principle that people sometimes forget. That's what was the founding philosophy on people's right to vote and those kinds of things. So one of the things that became apparent to me when I first ran for the assembly, I had a gentleman working for me in my campaign who was very enthusiastic. And he said to me one day, after working for months and helping out and volunteering, he says, gee, this is the first time in my life I really wish I could vote. And I said, well, why can't you vote? And he dropped his head silently and said, I'm an ex-felon. And I said, well, what does that have to do with voting? How long has it been since you've been out of, and it was like 15, 20 years. He did not believe he had the right to vote. And as we went to various churches and talked to ministers, and they were dealing with trying to get their congregation to turn out, and people would say, well, yes, I voted, Pastor, I voted. And then he would discover that they hadn't voted. And he discovered that many of them had been ex-felons and were too embarrassed to say that I can't vote because I'm an ex-felon. That had nothing to do with California law. California allowed ex-felons to vote, didn't have to write to the governor, no appeal, nothing. They have been able to, the right to vote has been with ex-felon for over 50 years. So the key was information. And it was interesting to me that when I was elected to this assembly and I was walking through the Capitol and people say, what's some of your legislation? And I would share with them that, and these would be lobbyists and attorneys. They all say, you mean ex-felons can vote in California? I mean, I think because it was so discussed in other states that people could not vote, they made an assumption that Californians could not. And these are people who were legislators, who were lobbyists, who were attorneys, had no idea. So the first thing we wanted to do was make sure people knew they could vote, and making sure that when they left prison, that they would be given information about their rights to vote. Okay. That became a major conflict. People had said it was too expensive to tell people they had the right to vote. It was too expensive to train probation officers and parole officers to simply say you have a right to vote. Our Secretary of State at the time thought it was too expensive to print registration cards. That was before we did registration by internet. Registration cards, he said, that's too expensive. I said, isn't that your job? I mean, isn't that a part of doing your business? That's standard stuff. It's like saying, I can't write your letter because I don't have a pencil and the pencils are too expensive or whatever. And so it was just really, we got into this battle with these folks, and we fought them on the issue, and we finally got some concessions. But the idea that people thought it was too difficult, too onerous, it was going to be too expensive at the legislature for us to mandate for somebody to simply say, you can now vote. Here's a card, register to vote if you choose. So we had to fight those battles. We had a battle about because we say you cannot vote if you're in prison, but jail is not prison. Okay, and so we had some things shifted around in one of our bills, and so some folks had longer sentences in jail. So our Secretary of State did not want to allow those people to vote. So once again, we had to fight that battle with the ACLU. We went to court. We fought the battle. The Secretary of State at the time, same woman, she fought us every step of the way. We won at one level, then she appealed it. So we had to fight again. And fortunately, we had Mr. Padilla, who came in as Secretary, who won the election, came in as Secretary of State, and he refused to continue to appeal it. And by him withdrawing the appeal, in one day, we like enfranchised 45,000 people who were in these jails. So then we had bills to say you can go in jails. Nonprofits can go and register people in jail. They can actually vote while they're in county jail. They're not the only people in California who cannot vote is the person who is physically in prison right now. We basically eliminated the parole issue. If you serve your time, you're on parole, you can vote. You can vote if you're on probation. You can vote if you're in the county jail. The only people who cannot vote is the person who sits in the state prison who cannot vote. But as soon as he leaves the state prison, he is immediately enfranchised and can vote. But what we had was really misinformation, people not wanting to share information. Those in authority, whether it was probation officers, did not want to. So what we're doing now with, as you know, Prop 17 just passed and said, that made it possible for folks to vote in parole. I was one of the co-authors on the bill in the House. And so now they can vote. So as Secretary of State, one of the first acts is that, okay, we're working now with the Department of Corrections and with our probation, our parole officers and what have you, so that those individuals have access to information before they leave prison, that they have the right to vote, that they can register to vote while they're there, and because they have a time that they're getting out, and to get them registered to vote. Of course, this continues to cause uproars in some folks' circles because they do not believe people who have ever committed any crime or any offense should have the right to vote. And so we have tried to simplify it as much as possible in California. We have a lot of advocates who are working with our former incarcerated and allowing them to do some things. But in addition to that, in my office as Secretary of State, we're making that a top priority in our outreach, that they will have the right to vote, and the state has passed it. And as a result of that, we will be in our outreach officers. We will be with CDCR. I've already sent them letters saying this is what you have to do. These folks you have to reach out to those who are already on parole and let them know that they have the right to vote, to get them necessary information. We hope to hopefully energize some folks who are community volunteers to begin to go and to register people to vote. But they've all been sent letters. Every person on parole in California has been sent a letter telling them they have the right to vote, and sent them the material to allow them to vote. And this upsets a lot of folks because they realize that once these people have the right to vote, they'll be making decisions that maybe they don't like, but nonetheless, these are decisions that they have the right to vote as citizens.
It's called democracy. So I want to come back to this thought about, kind of what it takes in terms of to get information out, because certainly this last election, I think, was a really great example of how important it was to get accurate information to the voters. But I don't want to lose track of getting the happy piece of the story that we want to hear from Desmond about what's happening now still in Florida. So let's do that first, and then we'll move on to some other topics.
But definitely, though, I like what Dr. Weber said, because, matter of fact, I termed it the Juneteenth phenomenon, right? Because, the story of Juneteenth, where slaves in Galveston, Texas, didn't find out that they were free until 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, in spite of the fact that the legislation impacted, about a little over 700,000 individuals, you got to remember, Amendment 4 cleared the pathway to 1.4 million. And so that meant that we had 600,000 plus individuals who did not have legal financial obligations that were eligible to register to vote right then and there. But the same problem Dr. Weber talked about is what we experience. Number one, folks think just because you have a felony conviction, you cannot vote, which was at one time true in Florida, of course. But then the other thing that we found was that we was running into so many people who didn't even know what Amendment 4 was, much less what it did, right? And then those that did just automatically assumed that they had some type of legal financial obligations. And there were so many people that applied to get help with fines and fees. And when we would actually do the research, find out that their felony was downgraded to a misdemeanor, so they never lost their rights, right? Or they never had a conviction because they had a withhold of adjudication, so they never lost their rights. Or if they did have a conviction, that they don't owe anything, right? And so it that was one of our biggest challenges about how could we get that word out to folks and actually to let them know that they're free, right? Because the majority of folks are still walking around in Florida, as in many other countries, even in Georgia, where we did some work in Georgia. We were running into people who thought they couldn't vote. But in Georgia, you can vote when you're not in prison. And so it was a trying time, but it is. And I got to say, it is good news. Uh, Immediately after the legislation passed, we immediately started working with the governor and the clemency board. Said, wait a minute, even in spite of the legislation, the governor has clemency powers, and there's some things that the governor can adopt in to really embrace period of Amendment 4. Not the same governor that led the effort against Amendment 4 as it relates to whether or not we should pay fines outstanding legal financial obligations. But today at the clemency hearing, the governor and the cabinet announced a new policy that basically says that if you qualify for Amendment 4, then you will automatically have your rights restored. And the big thing about that is that even though Amendment 4 passed, and I benefited from it, and I was able to vote in my very first presidential election last November, you know, I still could not practice law in the state of Florida because I can't apply to the Florida bar until my civil rights have been restored. So even though I had my voting rights restored, guess what? I still can't own or rent a home in many subdivisions in Florida until my civil rights have been restored. And so what the governor has basically done has allowed people who qualify for Amendment 4 to have all of their civil rights, excluding the right to possess a firearm, but they have all of their civil rights back, which now expands the opportunity for us to find employment, to get occupational licenses. It expands the opportunity for us to own or rent homes and provide a shelter for our families. And so that is the great news that I say, because guess what? You remember those 600,000 people that I told you about? Now, not only do they have their voting rights back, they have all of their civil rights back, and they don't have to apply. They don't have to worry about waiting in a backlog that could take over 10 years to be heard. And so we're very excited about the opportunity. It was a big step forward from previous policies that have been implemented, and we're looking forward to building on this new policy and ensure that more people are able to participate in our democracy. Now, I can't say, and I close with this, you're right, Professor McCord. We did engage in a fundraising effort that allowed us to raise over $27 million from over 90,000 individual donors, from the famous such as LeBron James and Ariana Grande and Michael Jordan, to the mom and pop in Seattle, Washington, that wanted to send $100, $200 to help free democracy. And with those $27 million, we were able to pay off the fines and fees of over 44,000 individuals in the state of Florida. And guess what? Because of the policy today, those 44,000 can now go register to vote. They can buy a home wherever they want. They're able now to have expanded opportunities and jobs. And so we're excited. We're still fighting. We want more, and we're going to get more. but we are very pleased with the way how things are playing out now.
That's amazing. That's a wonderful story. But I come back to, what it took to accomplish this, right? And everything that Secretary Weber and you've been talking about, it requires a great deal of people, activists, grassroots enthusiasm, effort. I mean, money too, but money alone can't do it. And I was just amazed and in awe of the efforts in this past presidential election, right? In Georgia with Fair Fight and Stacey Abrams and in other places. She's one of my heroes, by the way. I was on a panel with her once. I was like complete fangirl, but she's just amazing. Like, what did it take? Like, talk to us about what does it really take to kind of get the movement to achieve what was achieved in this last election? My husband and I were talking about how, yes, you had reports of long voter lines, but what you didn't have, like we've had in so many other elections, is people giving up because people were determined they were going to wait as long as it took to exercise their right to vote. But that took a ton of effort. The rules changed so many times, right? With mail-in voting, and then you can't drop off boxes. Then we're not going to let you drop off. And, in some states, the courts were changing the rules midstream. What does it take for you, both of you who've been involved in activism, to get people out there when it was so easy to say, oh my gosh, too confusing, I can't be bothered?
Well, I could tell you that this actually a good plug. A time for me to plug my book, right? Let my people vote, because it speaks to that. Let me tell you, there was a time when even all of the experts said, Desmond, are you insane? That would never happen. You would never pass a law to give people with felony convictions the right to vote, at least not in the state of Florida, right? And so there was no money, there was nothing. But there were for years, I drove around in my car, the entire state of Florida. I used to put at least 50,000 miles a year on my car without leaving the state of Florida, working out of the living room of my mother-in-law's home or the trunk of my car, right? We were at a point where our volunteers were taking the sheets off of their bed, going to an arts and crafts store, buying some paint and painting our logo on their bed sheets to use as tablecloth to collect petitions, right? And so it was a very, very, very difficult process, but it created something that was so beautiful. See, it's easy to, if you have what I call the movement sugar daddy, to, drop a few $1 million and says, you know what, I want this issue to be dealt with, right? And then you could pay everybody and anybody to do the work. But it's another thing when you have people showing up, because you know what? The civil rights movement didn't have a sugar daddy. Right? They had a group of people that stood on righteousness, that believed that what they were doing was of God, right? And it was the righteous and the right thing to do. And they moved forward. They didn't rely on any polling or focus groups, none of that. They knew it was the right thing to do. And that created that type of movement here in Florida that is struggling, using student loans to try to travel from one part of the state to the next and not knowing how you're going to get back. But that created a character and substance, right, of our movement. And it really made it so authentic and organic that it created a shield. It helped create a shield that prevented opposition from even attacking us, right? And so it's countless meetings. There are times I write in my book about how it's not a regret, but one of the things that I wish I could have attended my son's football games or practices more often, but I couldn't do it because I was traveling the state. There was eventually a time when I had to undergo surgery to remove part of my body because of the stress that I had to undergo. And so it is a sacrifice. And so when you ask that question about what it takes, I sum it up by saying this: it really takes you understanding whether you're a contributor, all right? Are you contributing to the movement, or are you committed to the movement? So you have to know your lane, and when you know your lane, you're able to thrive in that lane and understand that those that are committed, which means that those that are willing to lay their life on a line for this, right? Those who want to contribute got to make sure that you keep them considered, right? Push them forward, because it's going to be the soul of the committee that's going to carry you through the hard times, the rough times, when you might not have money for a commercial, you may not have money to pay canvases, but they're going to get people, they're going to drag people out the streets, to collect the petitions, to knock on the doors, to turn people out, to say yes for your movement.
Thank you for that. Dr. Weber, you want to add to that? That was a motivational.
Well, it's truly, it truly is. I mean, even when you get legislators like myself and some others who have a passion and who are willing to carry the legislation forward so that you don't have to do so much in terms of getting signatures and getting it on the ballot and those kinds of things. Because some of these things we've done can be done without getting on the ballot. We had to get the last one on the ballot about the parole, but the other things we could get by simply getting it through the legislature. And that sounds good and it's easy, but oftentimes those who are willing to make those changes are faced with tremendous odds and opposition. I mean, you know, for me to decide I'm going to do certain things in terms of law enforcement and engagement and those kinds of things, you know, there has to be an army behind you, that, you know, because on the other side, there is an army. There's an army of lobbyists and law enforcement and parole officers. And even though I chaired the public safety budget for the legislature when I was there, the interesting thing was that, you know, there were all these folks who made a living on keeping people incarcerated and made a living on not allowing certain things to happen, and knowing that there's a system that if you get a person out and you don't give them the opportunity to work, you don't give them opportunity to have to interact with their family appropriately and to buy a home or live in a decent place, you set this person up for failure. So therefore, there's an investment in not rehabilitating them and not providing resources. Why? Because then they recidivate and they're back in prison again. You know, and I've been in hearings where you know, after we changed our definition and said we're into rehabilitation, we're supposed to do this. I mean, I had the chief, one of the guys who ran all the place said, we don't do no rehabilitation. I said, we just changed your name to rehabilitation. How could you? He said, doesn't matter. We don't do rehabilitation. I mean, so this is the kind of resistance we're getting, you know, when you're dealing with these issues. And so if you're going to push those agendas, you have to be very clear. There has to be an army behind you that is going to help you. And oftentimes it's not only the families that are affected by it and the individuals who are affected by it, the policies that are there, but oftentimes the moral groups, the churches we've had. We have a group called PICO in California. I mean, ACLU works with us, but they do a lot of the legal stuff and help us immensely and those kinds of things. But we also rely upon this army, these organizations of social justice and equal justice and all these kinds of organizations. And the good thing is that eventually they will bring in some individuals who have resources that they can utilize. But oftentimes the real grunt work is done and knocking on the doors of the members of the Assembly and the Senate and making sure they vote a certain way and standing in their neighborhoods and walking their precincts in front of the office of the elected official to make sure they know that this is a bill that's of importance, and holding hearings in churches and neighborhoods. So there has to be this groundswell, because there is this other force that doesn't look like it has millions of people behind it, but it has millions of dollars behind it. And as a result, they can amplify it and frighten legislators by putting ads out against them, or when they run, help people run against them, and all those kinds of things that we've all kind of at some point been confronted with. But it does require a tremendous amount, because sometimes we forget, just like in voting, you know, you forget, you think, oh, this is great. We had more than 80% of Californians that vote. Oh my God, we should be so happy. We haven't had this number in 50, 60 years. This is wonderful. You know, we just had, and then you discover there's a group of people on the side that are really quite upset because they make their living on you not voting. Okay, that their existence is based on low voter turnout to get their people, the more affluent, to come out and vote. And the same is true when we talk about these other things in terms of incarceration. There's a whole industry that runs on prisons. There's a whole industry that runs on having a 70% recidivation rate. There's a whole industry that makes lives. And so when we start talking, well, we're going to close down prisons in California, we've reduced our prison population significantly in California. We had 180,000 people in prison. When I left the committee a few months ago, we had less than 80. and we have about 80,000 people in prison right now. So we've dropped about 100,000 people out of prison. We've taken our youth of prison population and dropped it down to just less than 100 or so. We had over 1,000 kids in our youth prison. So what has happened is due to the process of creating policies and programs and recidivism activities and alternatives to incarceration and so forth and so on, we've been getting to reduce that population, and we should be happy. We're talking about, we're actually, one of the last acts I did was to close the prison. So we're actually starting to close prisons in California. Well, that does not make people happy, because there are people who make their lives on prisons. And we sometimes forget that, because we sit around and we brag about it, and they're trying to figure out, how do we get more people back into those prisons? Why are we giving them so many opportunities? Why are we making it possible for those who've been in to get out and start a regular life again? I mean, is this not what it was about, and that prison is not about punishment, it's about rehabilitation. And I've had that argument with people about, wanting to be more punitive versus wanting to be rehabilitative. So there's a constant struggle, and it requires a tremendous amount of effort and energy, which is really important. I found that our young people in our universities are great resources to get this done. And it's a time in their life when they can do that investment, and they're walking and they're talking and they're doing, and they just get motivated, because when they can get something like Prop 17 passed in California, they're just ecstatic, because they realize it was that hard work, that being out front and getting those things done that made it happen. So, but it's not an easy task, because we forget that there is an opposition. Even though the cause may be righteous that we have, there's still those who see something else that we don't oftentimes see, and that is the economics behind incarceration, the economic behind people returning to prison. A high recidivism rate makes money. The building of prisons, the construction industry loves that. The other kind of industries that use cheap prison labor to accomplish certain goals and things makes it beneficial economically for people for businesses to thrive. And so there's a whole industrial complex that's out there, prison complex, that really lives on misery. And so we're constantly battling that, because they have another agenda, and they will consistently work against you and what you're trying to accomplish.
That's a perfect segue, this idea of competing agendas. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just saying, Dr. Weber has tried her hardest to get me all excited over here. And I think she did a great job, because she hit on so many great points. But let's go forward, because I know that something I'll be able to piggyback on some of the things.
So I wanted to kind of, use that point of, cause and opposition to bring us to this current moment. The elections clause, we're talking to a bunch of law students here. The elections clause of the Constitution gives power to the state's legislatures, as you well know, as Secretary of State, Secretary Weber, to determine the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives. But Congress has a veto card on that, right? Congress, by the Constitution, the US Congress, may at any time make or alter those rules. So right now, of course, being considered is H.R. 1, the For the People Act, sweeping voter reform that would essentially preempt the field and really thwart what seem to be pretty monumental efforts right now. Something over 250 bills been introduced to try to actually suppress voting. This would really thwart that activity. But one of my questions is, are you worried at all? Like, I look at H.R. 1 and I think, this is fantastic. I hope this passes. Probably won't pass unless they end the filibuster. They end the filibuster. Do you worry at all, as people who've been so involved in voting rights, that what about, if the Congress changes, right? And a new Congress comes in a few years and not only undoes the good work of H.R. 1, assuming it could even pass, but pivots the other way, right? Again, preempts states that want to be liberal with voting rights, such as California, and says, you have to purge voter rolls, you have to disenfranchise people, you have to do this, that, and the other. Are you worried about that? And let's start with Secretary Weber.
Yeah, we are very worried about it always, because California has its way of doing things, and we have been able to, try to get away from some of the draconian activities that occur in other states. And so we are always concerned as whether or not we would find ourselves in a position where we can't do the things that we know need to happen. But equally concerned, we're concerned about voting across the nation. I mean, I would be one thing to just be concerned about California, but Californians, we realize that when we end up with someone in the White House that is not necessarily friendly to anything, and it makes us spend all of our time and all of our energies resisting and fighting lawsuits against policies that are so anti not only California but anti-people, anti the nation. So there is a great concern, and that's one of the reasons why we are in the process in the Secretary of State's office is we're beginning to talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to help people understand what it was really about, because people don't understand what it was for, to understand what kind of voting policies exist in the state, to understand what it is to have suppression of voting. And while we still have people with us who were part of the voting issues in the 1960s and the 50s. We need to get their voices out to the public so that they understand what it's like to have to basically have to deal with literacy tests that sound good on the surface, but are really ways in which we eliminate people from the rolls. And to understand the various policies that are out there now that really are taking us back rather than forward, and have no basis other than the fact that people realize that they're a minority in terms of their thinking and want to, in their mind, as they said in the court the other day, level the playing field, which means they don't care what the majority wants. They want to make sure that they have equal access to everything else, like others, or more access, I should say. And so we're going to have to fight back. That is really clear in California, even though, like I said, I'm Secretary of State and have to deal with all the elections and other things like that. And we often get threats to us every day from people who will file complaints and this and that, but they know they can't win legislation, and because we are 80% Democrat in the Assembly and 80% Democrat in the Senate, and our governor is a Democrat, and on and on. So what they're doing is they're attacking the governor. They want to do recall on the governor for no reason. Even though all the constitutional officers are Democrat. And so they're going after us in other ways that are there. But equally important, we have to defend not only California, but we have to make the statement across the nation, because whatever happens in other states directly affects us, and especially at the federal level. To have these kinds of policies in other states is devastating, and to think that it impacts people's lives, that they cannot do certain things, and it's intentional. It's absolutely intentional to make sure that there's always a cheap and free labor that's available, as it was in slavery, that we've allowed, that we let people serve time, and some of those get more time than anybody else, and then they come out and they have no opportunity to rebuild their lives, to have a family, and to do those things. That is no more than 21st century slavery again and again and again, and it's often targeted towards those of color, and so we see that this pattern is there, and I think we have to begin to help and educate folks about what it really means. And so that's what we're going to try to do in the Secretary of State's office. We're going to try to have some webinars and some conversations across the state about what the new laws look like, what they mean, and have folks who can actually talk to them about how this operates in their state and what happens if this passes and what we would be missing. Because to take away the right to vote, to take away my right to have an absentee ballot, there's no rationale for it. There's absolutely no rationale. There's no fraud. There's no crime. There's no nothing that's been committed. But it basically says, let us look and see what things actually encourage people to vote. And what we did last time in the election encouraged people to vote. We had not only everybody got an absentee ballot, we ended up with we had 11 days to vote in many places, between 4 to 11 days. You could take your ballot to the polls. You can vote at the polls. You can vote by mail. You can drop it off at a box. We had so many ways that people could vote securely that we had such an enormous turnout of 80-some-odd%. And we want to continue that in California. And we think that's a pattern for everyone, that voting should not be so difficult, that to exercise your God-given right to vote should not be so difficult that only those who are affluent, who have resources, can actually make it to the polls. That is unacceptable. And so we're going to fight that. But yeah, we're concerned, greatly concerned about what's going on. And I've got editorials going out and articles in papers and all kinds of stuff. So people understand what we're doing here, but equally important, don't be snowed by what's happening somewhere else, because someone will come to California and try to sell us the same bill of goods. And unless people are informed to say, no, that's not here, then they will follow it.
Your thoughts on that, Desmond?
Yes. Yeah, I do believe that there is, I guess, a high level of concern around activists, but I do believe that that concern cannot be paralyzing, right? And there are some things that we can engage in right now. Call me a dreamer if you want, but I do believe that the more people that you get engaged in our democracy, the more vibrant it becomes, and it will prevent things like what you're talking about from happening. We've seen because of voter apathy, even at the local level, we have communities in which 10, 15% voter turnout, and these elected officials know that, and they lean more towards the lobbyists or the special interests than the people, because people just don't vote. But we were very encouraged by what happened in this past election. And knowing that, even what you've seen happen in Georgia, know that we have to engage with people year round, and just to build on what Dr. Weber says, not only do we have to just get the information out, we have to get the information out to the right people in the right format, right? Because if we're only talking to a certain demographics, or we're only speaking a certain type of language, then there is a group of folks, right, that are not getting touched, that we're not having conversations with, that we're not knocking on their doors, right, that are left out in the cold and waiting for someone who would speak to their fears to come along, who would take them away. And we got what we got in 2016. And so the thing that I like, and I hate to use the word most, but the thing that intrigues me most about this legislation that I'm hoping that would pass or get out of Congress is the fact that it actually creates an environment in which our public officials or our governmental agencies play a significant role in informing voters or potential voters about their rights and access to the ballot box. When Dr. Weber, when she mentioned PICO, my ears picked up a little bit, because when we were engaged in Amendment 4, we worked collaboratively with an affiliate called Faith in Florida. And we were able to engage over 827 congregations of faith, whether they're from the Jewish community, Islamic community, conservative Christians, conservative Latino evangelicals, as well as African-American clergy, that came together under one umbrella, right, about, let my people vote and forgiveness and redemption. One of the reasons why these churches or these institutions of faith is so valuable is that they help to magnify, right, our voices. They help to disseminate information in communities in which we did not necessarily have that type of access to. And so the job becomes much easier when we're able to work with the Secretary of State to help get that information out. We're able to work with supervisors of elections and other governmental agencies to do so. But when you live in a state in which they don't want to do it, and you're like you're baffled, why wouldn't a supervisor of election or a Secretary of State want every American citizen to participate in our democracy? Isn't that what democracy is all about? And why wouldn't they find the resources to make sure that you're creating an environment that make people feel like they want to vote rather than feeling like they have to vote? We're trying to make people, where I remember we had a legislature that said, he referenced a country in Africa where people had to walk, I think, 15 miles to go vote. And he wanted to create that same condition here in Florida. Really? That's not what democracy is all about. We claim that we're the land of the free and we're the leader of the free world, then we need to start acting like it. And I think that this piece of legislation, the John Lewis Act, addresses some of this and forces governmental agencies to do what they should have been doing in the first place. And if we take advantage of it now and engage as many people as we can and make sure that we're getting people registered and informed, right, that would, I believe, would stop the likelihood of you seeing a Congress getting flipped the other way and these type of laws being enacted. So the work starts now, not after it flips and they come at us, because we know they're coming at us.
I'm with you on that. That is a perfect ending. I know you both have commitments. It's 7 out here. I guess it's 4 out there on the West Coast. Secretary, this has been a great conversation. I hope people really come out of this very, very motivated because, you know, we accomplished something this last election, but the next one is right there already, right around the corner. And there's so much work to do. And I can't thank you enough. And thank you, Liam, and everyone that helped to put this together.
And thank you. I'd just like to thank you all on behalf of the Georgetown Law ACLU and Georgetown Law Students for Democratic Reform. Thank you to our amazing panelists, Dr. Weber and Mr. Meade, and our amazing moderator, Professor McCord. For anyone who wasn't able to view this or would like to view it again because it was really good, we'll have a recording on our Georgetown Law ACLU YouTube channel, which we'll hopefully be able to get out to everybody. Thank you all for coming. We've loved having you. And thank you again to our panelists and our moderators for a fantastic event.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Good night.